So welcome back. Today we will see how to create a simple DynamoDB in our AWS account. So let's go to our Visual Studio Code and create a file that we can work with. And you know the usual lines we always type. If you watched any of the previous videos, you need a main function, and then you need an import, and then you need a func. So let's grab a couple of lines from the previous video so that we can save a couple of minutes here. So we need this line for sure. So this is to load the default configs. Next is we need to create a DynamoDB client. So let's call it client, and then it's going to be DynamoDB dot new from config, and then we need to pass in this config which we created. So hopefully if we save it, it should add the import packages here. Let's see if that works. Okay. So it added the config, but not the Dynamo. So let's see if we can get some help here. So let's DynamoDB. So it is not adding the modules automatically, right? So we need to be able to figure out what that is. So let's go to the documentation and search DynamoDB. So if you go back, go to the services and then search for DynamoDB here. So this is the module we're looking for. So we need to grab this v2 package here. So you see the squiggly line because we need to download the packages, but at least this error is gone, right? So in order to remove the squiggly line, we can go back to the command line here, and then if you do go mod tidy, okay, now it's gone. So now let's continue. We are done with the creating the client, and then the next step is to create the the table, the input variables in which we'll be defining the table name and the keys are used in DynamoDB. So in order to do this, you need to be familiar with how a DynamoDB works, but you need a couple of things before you can actually call the create table within AWS. So the first thing is you need a table name. So let's go ahead and create that. We can just call it my table. And then you need to define a key schema for DynamoDB. So in order to do that, let's define a key schema, and then we tell DynamoDB the key schema element. So it's saying undeclared variable here. So let's continue and we'll look at the documentation. So we need to define the key schema element, and then you have to define the attribute name, and then you have to pass in the ID. And then we need to define the key type. And that's going to be, uh, this will be the partition key, which will be used inside the DynamoDB. So I'll just add a comment here so that you remember. So once you define the key schema element here, it says it's not declared by the package. So let's go back to the documentation, DynamoDB, and let's search for its attribute definitions is the types or attribute definitions. So key schema element, this is what we're looking for. So I had to pause it to debug this. So it is not using the DynamoDB module. So it is another module here, which is the type. And then it's types.key key schema element. So there you go. So that should fix that. And then we need to be defining the AWS attribute name and the partition key here. And then here it is going to be the types again. And then the type is key type is hash. Okay, I think that is, and now we need to be using all these three different variables. So we have to do one more thing. We also need to define the attribute type, which we used here, ID, and then we need to define what type it is. So in order to do that, you have to do the attribute definition. It's slightly confusing because you need to know how DynamoDB works under the covers. So let's do types dot attribute definition. And these things, even I'm not familiar with DynamoDB that much. I have to look at the documentation to get these different elements that's required to create the DynamoDB table. So the first thing you need is the attribute name. Then pass in the ID, which is what we created here. And then we need to define the type for the attribute. So we can use this, it's a string. So let's use this type. Okay, so now we created the key schema and the attribute definition. And now we can go ahead and create the DynamoDB and pass in these different values. So let's see the DynamoDB create table helper function here, create table. And it should be part of the client. create table. So the first one is the context, and the second one is the create table input, which we created last time. And then the last one is the optional parameters, which I don't think we'll be using it here. So let's continue with here. And then so we need the client, which we defined here. So we need the client. Create table. And then the first one is the context to do. And then we need to define the input variables. So in this case, we didn't actually do that. And we can either define a variable and we can pass in like we have been doing in the past. But just to give a slight variation from what we have been doing, I'm going to pass this input variables inline. So let's see how to do that. So you just have to pass in ampersand, and you call in the DynamoDB, and now you call the input table input, and then you can pass in the variables like you do here. So the different values is required is table name, and then you pass in the table name, which is the table, and then the next one is the key schema, and then it's going to be the key schema which we defined, and the next one is the attribute definition, and that's going to be the attribute definitions which we defined. We already defined the variable, so we just need the name of it, which is attribute definitions. Attribute, which is this value here. And lastly, we need to tell the billing mode, which is going to be type.billing mode. Pay per request. And then finally, when we come outside of this, if error not equal to null, we can say log.fatal. Error creating the table. And then finally, you can print a friendly message. Okay, I think that should do it. I know this was a little complicated, and we have to define the key schema, which is required. We have to tell the ID and the partition key, and we have to define what this key type is. And then we have to actually create the table and pass in the input variables. Here we also did a slight variation. You could have defined this as a separate parameter and pass in the input variable, or you can just pass it inline like this. So this is also good to have know, so that you can have two flavors of passing in the input. So let's save this and see if we can get this to work. So now we need to run the program. So let's go back to the console and then look at DynamoDB. So there are no tables here. Okay, so it's an error message, which is not bad. So let's say 41 syntax error. So let's back to the code. So it's complaining in here. So let's see what's wrong. Oh, I think I know what. So in order to define the attribute definitions, you need to have these are the values. This is how we define it. So you need to have another set of curly brackets here. And then if you remove this one, I think that should fix it. Yeah, that's gone. So yeah, this is the key schema and attribute definitions. And you need to define these values in its own braces here. So I think that should be good. So let's go back and run the program again. Okay, table created. If you go back to the AWS console, there you go. So the table is active. If you go back to the table, and you can see the ID string is here. We didn't define a sort key. There are no indexes, and yeah, we don't have much. This is a vanilla table, which we didn't pass in too many values. So I'm going to create the delete the DynamoDB table. So I don't want to have any extra charges. I don't think it's too much, but still, we don't have a need for this anytime soon. So I'm going to delete this right now. So this was a little bit complex than I thought. And the reason is I don't use DynamoDB that much. And but in the future, when we start using Lambda functions, we may need to use these functions so that we can input some values into the DynamoDB. So the next session, we will look at how to create KMS keys, like key management. KMS is the key managed service, which is used to create encryption keys for encrypting data. And it is very important you know how to create those keys. So we will see how to do that in the next session.